So my name is Sheena Patel. I am an architect from Crawley, just a suburb outside of London near Gatwick Airport, and I'm currently working in the Southeast Asian context with communities and looking at reviving cultural practices around ecology and the land. So my father's side of the family came over from Kenya, and it was before the rush of the Exodus and the Idi Amin expulsion. They had come into Crawley and they had settled in the suburbs. So my father and grandparents integrated into British society. They were one of the first families that came over in Crawley, and through that integration they kind of set up a livelihood for themselves, connecting and integrating in British society. So that's from my father's side, and how then I ended up here. So I'm a firstborn generation, born and bred in Crawley, studied in London, and through those avenues I managed to kind of explore other ways of working.
Tell me, you didn't mention your mother.
Yeah, so my mother is originally from India, in Gujarat. It's a state on the west side of India, on the border of... She was born in like an indigenous forest area, actually, a tribal area in a village called Vagai. Yeah, where the tigers... it was tiger territory. It was a jungle, and the dung jungle was... It was part of living with the tigers, the communities, and my grandfather had set up a livelihood. He had migrated from Gujarat, our ancestral home. He'd migrated to the dung to set up a livelihood and looked into foresting and working with communities in that region. So that's my mother's side of the story.
And why did your parents come to this country, and how did they come to this country?
So my father came through, before the influx, as I mentioned, in late 60s, through a steamer, as my grandma would describe it. And so he was very young. He was around 3 years old when he came to the UK. So he considered himself very British, with a flair of Indian roots and East African roots. Very proud of his heritage from East Africa, even though he spent very little time there. And my mother came through this alliance of marriage, when my father went to India, which was the norm in those days, and he met my mother and they got married. So both of them came together, and that's how their family was kind of born. My dad came with both of my grandparents, my ba and my dada, my granddad and my grandma. Both of them came with my dad, my eldest uncle, his eldest brother and his eldest sister. So it was a family unit that came, as well as my grandmother's side of the family. So it was her sisters and her brothers. So they all kind of came together. It was like a family migration that kind of integrated into British society, and that supported each other as well. So at times when they were vulnerable to integration, they were there for each other. And that's how our family and our ancestral lineage moved from East Africa to the United Kingdom.
And why did they leave?
They left because they saw better prospect, and they saw what was happening in neighbouring countries. British colonies were kind of... freedom was giving up their kind of colonial rights, and policies were changing, new leaders were coming, independence was being formed. Therefore, they saw it as an opportunity for a better life. Ultimately, that was the dialogue, and that was the vision and the narrative for most British East Africans. And India was then going through, it's just kind of after partition, famine, hunger, a lot of, very low GDP. There was a lot of economical, social factors that India was not an option. So they chose to come to the United Kingdom.
And I suppose your mother also came with her parents, your other grandparents.
Yeah, so my mother's side of the family was very much in India. My grandfather was a congressman, so his vision and idealistic was from a Gandhi perspective, and was like, I'm not leaving my country. So therefore, but the irony in that was, let me send my daughter to the foreign land kind of thing. So for her, she was alone here, nobody, integrating into, alone without family, nobody know, and she was 18 when she came, so very young, very, very feminine and very like sheltered, and with no support system except kind of trusting my father's side of the family to kind of take care and show her how life was going to be in the United Kingdom.
But they met here, isn't it?
They met in India. My father went to India to get married, and that was the norm in those days, where the men would go to India to find wives, as they like to kind of, and through that, my mother was brought into the family in the UK.
And then, what time was when they met?
They
when
met.
They came here?
It was 1980. They got married, and my mother came to the United Kingdom.
And how about the difficulties they?
I mean, for my mum, my mum still says when she came to the house, for example, she went into the kitchen, and the washing up needed to be done, and she's used to this culture where the washing up is done for her, and then so that was one. It was very kind of domesticated, but it was looked upon like, oh well, am I meant to do this? And well, yeah, that was the norm. So those small nuances kind of framed her understanding of life in the UK is very different from what we read and we have known about. We see this foreign land as this place of wealth, privilege. Actually, it's different to what the norm was in India and is in India today. So very different experiences. And the language, of course. My mother was fluent in Gujarati. My father was fluent in English with a few broken words of Gujarati. Could converse, but very little. So there was this kind of union of coming together through communication, which was difficult, but they managed. And so yeah, this whole role of language and culture, as well as emotional. I can't imagine how it was for my mother, coming from these privileges in India to not even a social construct, but the weather. British weather was very cold at the time. And that was something that the body also and the mind needed to kind of get accustomed to, that you had to, and that had an imprint. And a lot of people will speak about the climate, of how the sun and the cold framed settling in to the UK.
And what about the society? Did they feel
I guess at this
welcome?
I think so I was born, as I mentioned, in Crawley, and Crawley is a very close, it's a small suburb, a very small number of families kind of were there to support each other. It's real community from my perspective in the UK. It was just outside of London, so we didn't have access to everything in terms that London did, even mindset, which I can come on to later on, but the families were there for each other. So my mum wasn't the only one that was going through these experiences. She had a community of women that were going through the same kind of familiar emotions. They came from India together. They got married to these strangers, strangers. Let's look at, it's a very different dialogue to where we are today. And they married these strangers, had to kind of come into these joint families, break through these kind of social traditions and these perceptions about the UK from India. But what was the beauty of Crawley was that these women came together. So there was a circle of women in the same age range going through the very similar experiences, different but similar, and they were able to then form a pattern, and then they started having children together. So there was like this understanding of the land, the people, these marriages, these unions, but also this divine womanhood connection. And I can see that 60 years later, I can see, 50 years later, I can see these women come together. And when they talk about those, those experiences, they're able to say, well, when we were pregnant, we did this together. And there's real power in that, that in itself was grounding and integrating. And then that kind of passed on down to us. And we were born into this community, and my friends and I all kind of grew up together through our mothers. Whilst our mothers formed their own circle, our fathers did the same, but in a very different way. Whilst our mothers connected through tea, food, celebration, clothes, jewellery, and this makeup as well. I remember my mum being so fascinated about makeup because it was like, oh, you get to put colour on your face, which they didn't get to do in India. It was like these natural dyes that they would apply on the lips, and that they kind of made these pigments, which was a beautiful concept. But so there's these Western influences that kind of subtly came through in their day-to-day. And then the men also did the same. There was beer, this culture of British society, beer pub, which the men got together and played cricket on Sunday afternoons. In Crawley, we used to have this club called Edwards, and every Sunday our mums would, to do the house chores, send us with the dads, because it would be summer, we'd be playing games, and the dads were just very minimal, like child monitoring, but they played cricket, drank beer, had a barbecue, whilst the women did the chores. And then they would get all dressed up and curl their hair, and perm was a thing back then, and big earrings and Indian dresses. It wasn't even like they wore these Western, beautiful Indian salwars, Punjabi dresses as they kind of call them, and they just came dressed up, and they would sit drinking their orange juice, and the one or two women went ahead and drank a glass of wine, and that was like, oh my God. But that was a typical Sunday growing up in Crawley.
You just mentioned this quite idyllic atmosphere when
Yes.
they came together, and the man groups and the
Yes.
female group. How was their relationship to the majority white population?
So it was very I grew up, my father was very British. He was a man ahead his time. So even, I don't know if he had the intention was to not kind of connect to his roots and his identity, but very much a man ahead of his time. So whilst we lived in a community with people in Crawley, there was a very much we're different kind of thing. So he had, for the community in that area, he tried lots of businesses, did a lot of things, and then one day he came home and we were packing our bags to move to Tenerife, the Canary Island, because he wanted to set up businesses there, and so that's what we did. My middle brother and I were taken out of school. We weren't really in school, and he was like, you're going to learn by going hiking, swimming, the beach, and that's how you're going to learn for a few years whilst I figure it out. So we moved to Tenerife. We had a villa. Our life was in Tenerife, and my mum was there. Again, I guess my mum had to then have a second migration identity, because she was in Tenerife. She was forced to learn Spanish. Dad was forced to learn it, and he was fluent in it. But for her, Dad was busy with the businesses and setting up the business. But my mum felt home, the connection of home. So in Tenerife, she found lots of Sindhis. So Sindhis are a different type of demographic. So she went and connected with them. They were different. They weren't Gujarati, but they were Indian. So she would go to kitty parties and enjoy the time with these women. So what she was doing in Crawley, she kind of had to uproot and do that again in Tenerife. So she was then very sort of aware of the rituals and the practices of Sindhi community, very different to the Gujarati community. The food, the music, the prayer, the gods, the goddesses, the festivals. So they all started to feed into our daily lives as well as our other Hindu festivals. So that was then. So then whilst we meshed into British society with others, we were still the others kind of thing within the othering. So we moved to Tenerife, and after Tenerife, we came back home.
When was this?
It was the early 90s, so
early 90s.
90s.
And then you came back after?
Unfortunately, my father passed away in 1995, and our last business he opened was an Indian restaurant. And so my mum and us, we all had to pack up and come home. So that was Tenerife, that was that chapter closed, and then my mum had to come home and fully depend on this community in Crawley to integrate back in, except whilst we started making the transition before, we had come back to school. My father's death was the ultimate shut the door for our life and our livelihood in Tenerife. So we came back to Crawley, where my mother once again assimilated with the community, with those women, at the most vulnerable time of her life. And that's how we formed a very close-knit community in Crawley. And we've got a name and a reputation. So that was our kind of connection to come back to the United Kingdom from another land.
But you said we come home. Did she not think she goes back to she can go to India?
Well, India was an option, of course it was. Her father definitely wanted her to go home, whatever home was. But her home was where her children were, and her home was where her husband had bought her a home. Her home was no longer India, because she had spent her years creating and cultivating a home. So even now, when I speak to her, she goes to India regularly. She's like, I want to come home. And the home she's referring to is our home in Crawley.
So possibly you kept the home also when you were in Tenerife?
Yeah, we were in Tenerife, yes. We still had our home. So that home was always home for us, and for my mother too. So.
Do you remember any stories your father told you, or your grandparents? Well, you
yeah,
also,
my grandmother. Yes, I was brought up primarily by.
What did they tell you about East Africa?
Oh, I think East Africa was this golden period of my grandmother's life. She was like, you had her house, her help, her garden, living in a community with other family members and friends, and wearing these cotton saris and with gold, and so to show that the privilege that they had, and it was about also this, we can speak Swahili, extremely proud of this linguistic that was merged with Gujarati, which we all as firstborn generations have. Very proud of her time in Kenya, very proud, almost prouder than those who lived in India, to be like, look where we had come. But with that, if we break down the psyche, there's a lot to those feelings and that emotion and that sort of ego a little bit, I would say. However, but very proud to be East African, very proud to be Kenyan.
They came from which place?
Nairobi. They were in Nairobi, in the city itself, and they had come over. I guess it was whilst India gave them a lot, it was where the livelihood, they had made that livelihood in Kenya. East Africa, together with my grandfather, and they had their children in East Africa, in Kenya. I can see why that place has a hold. And it's something, we may never understand, because we weren't part of, those beautiful narratives of East Africa and those stories of, again, how they had to integrate into that society. Couldn't have been easy. But they did it, just how they've done it here in the UK.
So they also migrated from Gujarat?
Yeah, so they migrated from Gujarat. My grandfather's father had passed away when my grandfather was very young. He was about 5 years old. And in those days, so they lived in India in this gam called Bhadran. My grandfather was an only child, and his mother, so my great-grandmother, had to then be dressed in a black sari and be kind of shunned, so she was then sent back to her maternal home, which meant that she was living in darkness for the rest of her life. So my grandfather's uncles, who were settled in Kenya, had come to India and saw that this young lad's life, so they took him, in that time that they did, that was the norm, to kind of hunter-gathering kind of principle. And so my grandfather had then been assimilated from a young age to Kenyan society, cut away from his mother. So there's that trauma of that bond wasn't there. And that's how they were taken, that's how he went to Kenya. And then he came back to India. That was the norm, to get married, where he met my grandmother. And they went to Kenya together and started a life there. So for her, it was her prime years of similar to what Mum went through. It was her time of, having a livelihood, integrating into a new culture, a new country, a continent even, language, climate, and making a mark for herself.
Who are you?
Who am I?
Thinking about all the stories you told me.
Right. So the Sheena I'm Sheena. I'm a creative, absolute creative. That's who I am, as how I identify myself. But behind that creativity, there's this identity of a woman who is extremely proud to be of Indian heritage, and those connections, those very faint connections to Kenya, because I haven't been. I was never able to hear the stories from my dad's first-hand experience. They've always been passed down, so it's been difficult on an emotional level to understand what my father meant, even though he was very young when he grew up, he left. So for me, it's tapping into this tapestry through stories of others about Dad, but from what I remember of my grandma, I'm trying to weave those into who I am today. And then my mother's side of, that Indian heritage is very evident. I've been going to India every single year for as long as I can remember. I now work in India. I work for an Indian firm, and I work in communities on ground in India, in West India at the moment. So I'm trying to understand who I am through that. And so I'm extremely proud, as I've mentioned, of being an Indian. However, home is kind of, and this idea of this, like in India, I'm a foreigner, let's face it. I'm termed as this NRI, non-resident Indian. And whilst, people that I work with and friends that I have, we kind of have this sort of joking narrative around the privileges that an NRI has. Of course, I'm aware of those. However, it's really difficult for an Indian, a Western, like a British Indian woman, to integrate into that land, because my mannerisms, my language, my accent, everything changes. And so, but then when I'm at home, whilst London, it is home, the UK is home, it feels more grounding, it feels more accepting. Grew up around a community with friends and family members in Crawley. That was my childhood. Playing in the parks and, cycling around, Tilgate picnics, and Tilgate Park is this beautiful park that we have, and we were lucky that we were in the suburbs, so we had lots of green spaces. So Crawley, and growing up, particularly in the spring and the summer, was about being outside most of the time. And in the winters, in the cold months, it was about being inside together with family. So there was this contrast of like having the best of both worlds, being with family, inside, indoors, celebrating festivals. Like Christmas was a big thing for us, and so was Diwali, but we emphasised on Christmas so much. And then over the years, we kind of understood the significance of Diwali and incorporated that into our calendar, and now it's both festivals are equally as important. That's how I grew up, in a very close community.
And how did you feel when you came in primary and secondary school?
So I came in very late after Tenerife. I was trying to integrate into a schooling system that I didn't really have. I wasn't going to school like children who were around me. And I saw the world differently. I'd been in beaches and climbing mountains in Tenerife, and then I was in a classroom. So the concept was very strange. And then there was this loss at home that was I couldn't quite understand. One day my dad was at home, dropped us off to school, and then the next day he wasn't. So as a 7-year-old, there's a lot kind of you're trying to figure out, and then everybody around you knows how to count, subtract, multiply, and you can do that, but you do it differently. You know, my dad and mum taught me with pasta shells and, you know, counting in different ways, not with the units that we had at school, and a very conformed system. So I always knew I didn't fit in, but I didn't know how to stretch myself, because there was a societal pressure too. You know, there were layers of my upbringing to Crawley too. There wasn't just this coming back, there was this idea of grief too. And that played a huge role in who I am today. And I can't deny that. That's part of my identity. That shaped how I saw the world very differently.
And how did you see yourself there?
You know, I mean, like my teachers would always say she's always up in the clouds, you know, I was talking to myself, talking to the clouds, and a different way of drawing and doodling and describing and articulating myself, because I had grown up in a very different environment compared to my friends and those in the classroom. So I would describe it as, you know, very fairy tale-like as a child, which took some time to kind of snap out of that realm, you know.
And how was your relationship to the other kids?
I was very shy. Very shy. I always, with my friends who knew me from before I entered school, comfortable. But the school, very shy. Timid, quiet, very, very shy, like, and scared. I don't think it was just the fact that I was quiet and scared to even put my hand up. When I knew the answer, I look back and I think about that. I knew the answer so many times, but I was so afraid because I was scared to be vulnerable in case the answer was wrong. And that had stemmed from things that were going on at home.
Right, but you went through the schooling system. You did your A levels.
Yeah, I did. I went through school. My first school, I was at Northgate Primary School, and then I went through some middle school, Northgate Middle School, and I remember my teachers always used to put me forward for these extracurricular art craft. You know, they knew. I remember we had a bamboo making lantern workshop, which, you know, I did differently. My friends didn't, you know, they were very academic. And then it was in year 6, and I remember we were studying ancient Egypt and ancient Greeks, and I was like, oh my God, these ancient civilizations sparked my curiosity to know more about the world, which then translated into doing a lot of music workshops and dance workshops within school. So I was very creative already in the middle school area. And then I went to secondary school, and I focused a lot on art. Yeah, art was my kind of thing. Spent hours as I grew and did my A levels and GCSEs. Spent hours in my classroom painting in my own time, my free time, my lunch breaks. You know, I was very intuitive and in tune with subjects like food technology, textiles, religious education, history, world history. So those were those subjects that kind of made me different to my friends who were from the Indian community, who had grown up together. I was very different. At the time, I was afraid to be different. I felt like I was the weird one. But now I'm glad that I had to go through that, because this is who I am. This was who Sheena is. And I couldn't block that up, which then led me to go study architecture at university. So I did 7 years of training in architecture. And through architecture was a field, you know, mine for me, because architecture is a subject that allows you to explore every social science and tectonic, art, creativity, climate, land, ecology, ritual. I can go on. It allowed for that, and I needed a container to spill that into something more tangible that allowed me to go and practice in a very different way. So that's how I would describe my journey.
And did you experience something like racism and animosity?
I would. There were times in Crawley there were kind of differences, but in the school, and I must admit in the school that I went to, it was very multicultural, and we kind of kept into our Asian groups. When I mean Asian, it wasn't just Indians and Gujaratis. It was like, let's mix with the different ethnic minorities too. So there was I had Muslim friends, Sikh friends, And it was a beautiful mix. So it was starting to then conform and come together. As we grew older, we recognised. So we were always known as the Asian kids, you know, but we had each other's back kind of thing. Not to say we had any animosity against anyone else. It was more, it's a sense of belonging. You know, I recognise that we stand out, we're different, and we want to hold each other. We want to hold each other to own it. If we were going to wear something different to school, then we were going to own it together rather than secluded on the side. So yeah, those form of subtle, it's very nuanced though, isn't it? It's subtle, but that was there. When I came to architecture school, it was diverse as anything. I was stepping into London. I studied in the heart of London at Westminster. You know, I lived in Baker Street, so it was in one of these prime location spots where tourism was around me constantly. But through architecture school, we kind of, again, the ethnic minorities came together. Yemeni, Somalian, Nigerian, we all kind of came together. Pakistani, Bangladeshi. It was a beautiful mix, which we then learnt from each other, and it shaped our practice and our creative thinking. But I would say we thought we were at the edge. I did when I finished. I thought I was at the edge. I was a brown, British Asian woman that could maybe tap into a very white, prominent, but it wasn't as easy. Which I don't dwell on too much because it led me to a different journey. But for me personally, it was a tough one to find work.
It wasn't easy. It was tough. Why?
I always felt like I was not good enough for these roles and these interviews that I was going with, you know, with pretension male. So there's layers to it, right? White, pretentious, middle-class men interviewing me. And I always felt like I just wasn't good enough, even though my portfolio said something else. I remember walking away from an interview in Shepherd's Bush, feeling like, oh, I've not experienced this. I've heard about it, I've read about it, but it was different to experience it. And it happened again and again. And then we kind of, it was a different time 15 years ago, so we weren't in the space that we are in today, and I'm glad we're not. But whilst I thought I was at the edge of architecture and architecture school and coming out as a British Asian woman, British Indian woman, it was a different story. And we also didn't know, as we were the firstborn generation, so as together I don't think we kind of knew what this was all about. It was very layered, until now when we talk about it we can put some labels and some terms to this kind of behaviour, but at the time it was a different world.
If somebody would ask you, how would you identify yourself?
I would identify myself as an Indian British woman. My roots run deep in India, so I'm Indian first, and it's a term actually somebody highlighted when I'm working in India. I normally would say British Indian, but actually my mother tongue is Gujarati. Those were the first words I learnt at home from my grandmother in Crawley. It was until very later I learnt English. I learnt Gujarati. I learnt to eat Gujarati food with my hands. So those were those influences from India. So I'm an Indian British.
And how do you think other people see you?
Other people see me they see me as a free-spirited creative, very different. They know me, my friends and those who know me well enough see me as this, you know, I often get names, but they see me as a free-spirited, but as very proud of being Indian. I'm very proud of my heritage, and this othering and this foreign kind of dialogue. For being a foreigner in my own land doesn't kind of express that I'm a foreigner there. It's just being a foreigner is a perception about a place and a time for somebody. So I feel like when people describe me, they see me as a creative, and that's how I'd like to keep my identity. forever flowing, you know. There's no end to creativity, and I don't want any boundary to stop that.
You mentioned the word foreigner. Did anybody hint that you are a foreigner in this country?
Yeah, absolutely, right. You know,
tell me.
Yeah. So, you know, where are you from is this prime question. Crawley. I was born in Crawley Hospital. Oh yeah, okay. Where are you really from? You know, that is, I've been so used to that in my workplace, and I'm like, oh, what you mean is where my ancestry is from. You know, let's just reframe the question. And then I can tell you, but I'm from Crawley. When I go to India, I'm from Crawley. And when I go to East Africa, well, I haven't been yet, but when I do go, I will be from Crawley. Well, the question is, how we want to frame it is, where is your ancestry? Because that changes the narrative completely. When you ask me about my ancestry and my cultural heritage, it runs from India with flair, and from Kenya.
Did you feel offended if somebody?
I mean, yeah, when I was younger, absolutely, right. So those were again very subtle tones of racism. Of course I did, and you know, I was young and my teen, I'd get angry and be like, what do they mean? I belong here as much. And we didn't, growing up in the United Kingdom, we weren't taught colonization. We were not taught about the empire and the effects. So we kind of had to do that independently and study that independently, and then have conversations with our parents, our grandparents around the nuances of colonization and actually what impact it had on the collective, because it wasn't individual anymore. It was on both sides. It wasn't just an India and a Pakistan community. It was a collective. It still echoes today when we've got, you know, the beauty of being in London and the UK is that you've got Indian friends and Pakistani friends. So that's the beauty of, like, actually when we sit down and we talk about it, it's a collective grief and it was a collective behaviour. So I did feel offended. I did absolutely feel offended. But now I look at it, you know, it's an education thing. So I won't lash out and be brash. I would just say what you really mean is where my ancestry is from. Because if we look at the patterns, then actually my land was conquered by the people of this land. You may not be directly from this land. You may again have traces from other lands. But the people from this land had conquered. And that's why I'm here.
I'm here because you were there.
Because you were there, yeah. I'm here because you were there. And so this idea of being a foreigner, again, it comes back to a foreigner. It's about perception. It's that person's perception of you as a foreigner. Because in India, I'm considered a foreigner, right? They've already labelled me. They've given me a label, an NRI, you know, that has this British accent, but she looks like us, but she doesn't speak like us. So you've labelled me as a foreigner there, which I get because I don't know how to navigate the streets, and I don't know how to haggle, and I don't know the complexities of Indian society, even though I've been living there for the last year. But I do know how to get off the tube here, and I know how to behave, you know, like how we all get as Londoners, and that comes in. So that's me accepting my foreignness in my home. So
you just mentioned you already worked 1 year in India. Can you tell us, maybe connect, you finished with your studies, architecture,
yes,
and you worked afterwards, and then
yes.
How did you get to India?
Sure.
In this sequence.
So having finished architecture school, I was very much interested in communities and engaging with communities. There's a term that they like to call community development. I don't feel like it should be termed as development because the community is already existing. So actually we're engaging and learning from each other. So I want to try and change that term. But so yeah, I was always very involved in community engagement. So I did a lot of architectural and international workshops in communities in India, Nepal, right up to the north of India in a place called Ladakh, Kashmir, Uttarakhand. And so I was very much, and that's also how I started to kind of be confident in speaking Hindi. Now, Hindi is not my mother tongue, but I learnt it from Bollywood films, so I'm grateful. But then using my skills and using my time in these communities, I really brushed up my Hindi. So I was able to speak fluently and articulate myself in these rural communities. So I felt like they could trust me, because that's an important... So most of my practice has been around creating placemaking dialogues with communities abroad. And I did a year in Canada, something very similar, working with First Nation and Native Canadian communities. So there was a link that there's a sense of belonging for me too. So that's how my practice was shaped. Through that I did a lot of artwork as well, writing, creative, creating different models, working in schools with children. And then this led me to the climate. I was very much interested in the climate space and the land, as I've mentioned before, and I genuinely feel like the climate is about honouring the land and worshipping the land. And it's something we've kind of done through our rituals in the Hindu festivals. Most of our festivals are centred around the land and agriculture. So I kind of wanted to dive deeper into the spiritual meaning of this idea of land and connection. So I took myself into a climate space where communities around forests and tribal communities, and that led me to a job opportunity in India where we plant mangroves in the Sundarbans, for example. That's my first project, and we kind of work with communities in the Sundarbans. The Sundarbans is the world's largest mangrove forest, and it sits in the delta between Bangladesh and India. 60% is in Bangladesh, but 40% is in India. So it's a really it's a fragile ecosystem, and it's an ecosystem within itself. So I took this opportunity to work with women and children in West Bengal. Now, I'm not from West Bengal. I can't speak the language. I know very little about the history, but working in West Bengal has made me more adverse to the region and made myself aware of the role West Bengal had in colonization. It was also the gateway to the British coming. So for me, that's the kind of work I've been doing, and for the past year I've been living and working in the Sundarbans for the last 11 months, learning the language, listening to Bengali songs, listening and reading about the literature, the political movement. You know, there's a lot that shaped the state and the current state the situation is, for me to then allow to go and navigate in such a complex territory. So that's what I've been doing for the past 10 months, and that really has shaped this idea of this foreigner, where I'd been the foreigner. Of course I was the foreigner when I went in, but now that that's changed. I'm their Didi now. You know, Didi is the term that they use as a sister, but I'm their Didi. I'm theirs. I belong. I've kind of been like embraced, and they are mine too. They're my field team, and those community members are very much mine. So where I felt like a very much of an outsider when I first went there, and I was like, I will never be able to integrate or gain the trust of these community members, these women, these kids, even these men, you know, they're never going to trust me. But a year later, spending a year with them in field, from everything, I've done everything in West Bengal, you know, they have these ponds, everybody in Sundarbans have these fishing ponds. I'm a hardcore vegetarian. I don't eat fish, I don't eat eggs, and I don't eat meat. And the diet there is very much around, you know, a very meat, fish eating diet. But I've gone into these ponds infested with, like, you know, lizards and snakes and fish, and I've gone and done fishing with them. You know, the houses some houses are quite rural, so they use the dung from the cows and they kind of apply it. And with my bare hands, I've applied it to get that feeling of connection to the earth. I wanted to ensure that I'm in this with them, to cutting fish, to scaling fish. I've done it all with my bare hands. I've tolerated the mosquitoes. I've seen the snakes. I've seen the water monitor lizards. And geckos have fallen on my head. And now it's just become this norm, you know. I've done everything I could. I've given everything, my soul, my heart, my body to the Sundarbans, all in this kind of idea of honouring this landscape and the land, which sits by the water. And the most important, you know, the main story of the Sundarbans is the Royal Bengal tiger, which I haven't seen yet, but the spirit is very much evident. And this tiger narrative shapes your behaviour. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 months, yeah.
What was the main difficulty for you? Think about it first.
The main difficulty...
Don't talk about the gecko, of course. You know what I mean?
Trust. How was I going to trust? How were these people going to trust me? Because I was a foreigner.
And how did you gain that?
When I went there, I didn't think I could. I genuinely didn't think I could gain their trust. I had to show them that I was in it. I learnt the language. I dressed according to the norm there. I didn't succumb to eating fish or meat, but I was in it, you know. I rode it out in the heat, 40 degrees, tropical. I rode it out with the mosquitoes, the isolation. I was alone in this field. I didn't have anyone with me to show them time and time again, come up with ideas, workshops, and you know, that this was for the better, that I was in this to do this with them for the betterment of their community. It was the hardest thing was gaining their trust. And then it came to, was I able to deliver this? I had a huge responsibility. It's about designing a livelihood initiative for women and men and children in a very complex region. So it wasn't a field exercise. It was going to get down to the ground. And you know, the kids trusted me too. I would go and do nursery rhymes and sing with them, and we'd dance and do workshops. And so when the innocence of those children see me as like, Didi's come here to do something, what is Didi going to do? And remember, Sundarbans is a very vulnerable place too. It's vulnerable to climate change. So for me, the responsibility I had was I had to get their trust.
Talking about your work, do you feel you were qualified there?
No, I didn't feel I was. I don't think anybody can, no matter how much field experience you have, we can't be qualified. We don't come from these places or this land. We don't understand, like, I'm here today in London, you know, and they're getting ready for the summer, the heat, cyclones, monsoons, soil erosion. So how can I be qualified to deal with that? I don't think you can. You need to live there to feel it, to be qualified to. But my skill set, and I guess my personality, my emotional intelligence, I wouldn't even say my intellect took me through this process. My intuitiveness and the emotional resilience that I had to work in. This is the most complex community I've ever worked with, in my opinion. That allowed me, and also this like divine intervention from this forest goddess that they have, Bono Bibi. I felt like she gave me permission, you know. 10 months later she was like, I trust you to do this, and I'm riding with it, and I'm holding her close to my heart to ensure that I'm able to deliver the change that I want to see, you know, as well as the change I believe is coming. So, no, to answer the question, no, I don't think I was qualified.
And now, nearly 1 year later, how you feel now?
Now, you know, my last trip to the Sundarbans, I was in there for 3 weeks, and, you know, when the head kind of comes up to you and says, you've done this with your heart, you know, and you can see it in his eyes and you can see it in mine. Yeah, I did. And now I don't feel like that foreigner. I feel like I can go, I can speak my broken Bengali and be accepted. And then again, it comes back to the perception. A foreigner is a perception of the self.
Right, and you continue working there? So
Yeah.
what is your
So
planning about today's?
So
Tomorrow?
I will head back soon in November potentially now. I've got a bit of a break because it'll be heat, it'll be hot. I may do a check-in visit. But I'm working remotely now to develop strategies and planning and implementation tasks so we can move for more of a holistic health model, and where we can work with health specialists. So that's my next project. A
holistic
health project, yeah. So that requires me to kind of be a bit more grounded and make a plan of action, and then invite experts from regions who have worked in the Sundarbans. So I'm still very much involved in the mangroves and the planting and the storytelling of the Sundarbans. Every day the Sundarbans comes in conversation. For a little while, I'm just not physically present in the field, but it doesn't mean that I don't speak to the team regularly. So they know that she's still in the picture. But this was the idea now, is just to give them, the community and the field team, some tools to work without me, so then we have a safe and a clear exit strategy, because that's what we want to do. We want to ensure that the community can just start standing on their own feet, and we kind of guide them through. So that's where I'm at now. Before I hand over fully, I've kind of just taken a step back, and then that's the best way, I believe, to kind of handhold from afar and then let them ride.
And the organization you work for is an NGO?
So it's a project developer, yeah, a V&V, Value Network Ventures. So we're a project developer that plant sort of trees. So we primarily look at projects to offset carbon for investment. So that's what we do as a company.
And do you think the people need such an NGO?
The people in the Sundarbans need this kind of project development and infrastructure, because that investment comes. Unfortunately, the world we live in, the grants and the fundraising strategies, it's not enough to cover such a vast. And it's through these kind of project development, we can then, there's more of a flow of cash and a larger infrastructure project that can happen, because there's investment involved. But there's also this idea of planting. So we're, at the same time, there's plantation happening. So we're preserving and reforesting our planet at the same time. So in this region, the expertise is required. But then the idea is to upskill and hand these expertise over, so they can then fulfill it themselves.
You're also an avid traveler, isn't it?
Yes, of course.
Tell us about that.
I have spent a lot of time travelling. I've travelled most of the southeast region, and India I've done north to south. I guess after architecture school, this identity, this quest for identity, who am I? As we do, go for these journeys to go find ourselves, whatever that may look like. So I went to explored Southeast Asia, a little bit of the Middle East, Central America, and those my travel has shaped a lot of my practice too. That's kind of influenced the way that I practice my work and write and contribute to these creative programs and creative jobs that come my way. So travel has played a huge role in shaping me as well. Traveling has given me freedom and knowledge and curiosity, that there's a world beyond the four walls that we live in, and travel allows for experience, and travel allows for you to feel. And then in travel, yes, you question the identity, but when you're traveling, the foreigner doesn't come too much, because you're flowing through that space, so it's not as, it doesn't hit home as much as if somebody were to ask me where I was from in the UK, because we're all in these nomadic spaces, we're traveling, and we're moving constantly. So you feel actually at home when you're traveling because everybody's in the same boat.
And previously you were also involved in a community organization called Subprime Arts.
Yes, I was.
Can you talk about that?
Oh yes. Subrun came through, again via the community in Crawley. They had done some work in Crawley, and initially I was very much interested in henna art, so I was sort of involved through henna, my love for applying henna, and we did some workshops, and that led to these questions. And I had done my thesis on identity and sense of belonging, so Lata Auntie, who kind of looks after Subrang, has kept me in mind, and I kind of conveyed to her. I remember when Gujarat, the Yatra was done, and I went to see the exhibition. I was like, oh, I wish I was part of this, And she always said that she'd keep me in mind. She wasn't aware that I had this kind of interest. And then through the years, we've done a lot of work and collaborated on lots of projects. Roots and Changes was looking at the patterns of migration from a Gujarati community, and then Kala Setu looked at building bridges, cultural bridges between the wider Indian diaspora, and we had tangible results from that with batik and silk painting. So through that I managed to work with Kinetica, is a studio in Purfleet, just outside of London. So I did some work with them for a few years, trained as a batik artist. That all came through Subrang, and then through Subrang we've done lots of and we did Exodus as well. So there's lots of work and this is where my creativity can come out as well, and this again ties up to who I am, because this is also who I am. I want to be my own little archive of the information of my entire cultural heritage. I want to be a walking, talking archive. So yeah, working with Subrang has been a delight, and it's reassuring to see that there's a platform for these kind of opportunities, and particularly artists and like myself, where there is a platform where we can kind of be in a round table and have a conversation, because they're all these feelings and emotions are internally bubbling. We just need a space, an outlet. So we've done some amazing work together. So yeah, and we continue to.
A question regarding this society here. Right now there was a discussion about the impact of the Windrust generation, and generally about issues of colonialism and how we deal with that. Does it somehow, is it important for this discussion?
I think yes, it's important. It's important to be aware and to understand the sacrifices that have been made. But I don't think we can continue to use that as a victim card. I think we need to understand it happened, and we need to, I wouldn't say move on and get over it, but integrate with it, rather than pointing fingers, because if we're going to do that, we're going to get into the same rat race, again and again. I think it's a time, and we're in a crucial time now where we need to educate ourselves. And I'm saying to every Indian diaspora or Asian diaspora, understand your heritage and the sacrifices that were made, and read up about colonization, because it was a collective grief that we're all grieving, and we need to shed those layers together. We need to retain what happened and understand it, but we need to move on from it. We need to kind of integrate into it, and that's where I'm saying we can do that through lots of different modalities, through art, music, storytelling, theatre, workshops, and of course the food. We can host discussions and have discussions around this topic. It runs deep, it's visceral, it's in the collective, it's in the body. But I'm saying we live in a place, in a society now that allows us to express it. So let's express the beauty of it, as well as being aware this is where this is stemmed from. So I'm all for it. I'm just saying let's creatively put it in a container and have a conversation about it.
What do you think about the future? It could be a personal side or it could be general side. What do you feel?
Well, I'll take a personal side, I guess. The future could be a very diverse community, and these threads that are woven together, and a new tapestry and a new history has come out of what's going on. And I want to be part of it. I want to be part of this new history, this new dialogue, weaving these threads from different parts of, be it India or the world. I want to weave a new rug together. And in that rug and that tapestry, these fragments of my mother's memory, my father's story, and my grandmother's recipe. And that is this foreign way of looking at how you want to see me, but that's what I want to do. I also want to tell you about, you know, India and through like my experiences, but I also want to hear yours. How was it for you? I want to hold space, and I want to hold a container for you, and I can't do that if I keep continuing to talk about me. So let's weave it together. So that's how I see it on a personal front, and that's what I want to do.